What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. There are moments in this war when the headlines distract everyone from the only question that actually matters. How do you stop the sky from falling on Russian cities? Because while pro-Kremlin bloggers argue about proper retaliation and TV hosts perform Olympic-level mental gymnastics, figure out stuff and creating unheard stories, the real story is happening far away from studios and Telegram channels. It is happening in Belgorod, where neighborhoods went dark in a single second. It is happening in Stary Oskol and Shebekina, where entire districts suddenly lost water. It is also happening in Kharkiv, where explosions shook the city so violently, people thought a nuclear bomb had gone off. And it is happening everywhere along the Russian-Ukrainian border, where both sides strike power grids, substations, and hit plants as though they were some kind of chess pieces, instead of the backbone of life itself. But beyond that, there is another story. One, the Kremlin does everything to avoid. Right now, inside Russia itself, dozens of regions are entering winter with energy systems already in critical condition. Power grids that were crumbling long before the war are now being pushed beyond their breaking points. Substations are failing, heat supply is unstable, and some cities are preparing for rolling blackouts, because so many power plants and oil reservoirs have been hit by Ukrainian drones that regional authorities literally cannot keep up. Russia always pretended that this war would only destroy Ukraine, but these days it is destroying Russia's power grid too, piece by piece, spark by spark. So today, let's talk about how this madness began, how propaganda tried to disguise it as a strategy, why both sides are now striking energy systems, and why, at the end of the day, every blackout in Belgorod or Kursk has the same answer. A war that should have ended years ago but continues only because one man refuses to stop. 3 days before the Belgorod power plant strike in late September, something strange happened on Russian television. NTV channel, basically. NTV aired a talk show where a guest demanded that Russia destroy Ukraine's entire energy system, while the host, clearly reading from pre-approved spreadsheet, argued that Russia does not strike civilian infrastructure and never will. They debated as though they lived in completely parallel timelines. One where electricity is sacred, and one where it's perfectly acceptable to unplug a neighboring nation from the 21st century completely. But to see where this contradiction comes from, we need to go back to the very beginning, to September 11, 2022. On that day, Kharkiv lit up the sky with a blast so enormous, people genuinely believed Russia had finally, I guess for Russian propaganda, used some kind of tactical nuclear weapons. Obviously it was not the case. The truth was almost still as shocking. For the first time in this war, Russian missiles deliberately targeted the Kharkiv civilian heat and power plant supplying electricity and heating to hundreds of thousands of people. It was the day Russia introduced a new quality, quote-unquote, of warfare, as Dmitry Kislov bragged on his Sunday primetime show. "It's getting serious," he said, almost excited. Ukraine's power grid was collapsing, water pumps shut down, communications failed. Whole regions sat down in darkness. This was not a military strategy. It had no battlefield logic. Diesel locomotives do not depend on electricity, and military logistics do not fall apart when civilians cannot use microwaves to heat their lunches and dinners. Well, but Kremlin never cared about logic. They never used it. The Ukrainian counteroffensive had humiliated them, and they wanted just simply revenge. So they turned lights off in Kiev, Dnipro, Poltava, Sumy, anywhere they could, basically. Typical Kremlin-level response, if you think about it. You cannot beat them on the battlefield, so just beat their women, children, and elder people. And suddenly the rules changed. The propaganda line switched overnight from "we strike only military targets" to "electricity is a privilege, not a right." And here is the darkest and the coldest irony. When Russia crossed that line in 2022, it threw a boomerang. It just took 2 years for that boomerang to return. And when it did, it smashed directly into Belgorod, Kursk, and other neighboring regions first. Distant places in Russia became unsafe as well, just obviously a little bit later. Because once you make power plants a target, you make them a target for everyone. You cannot play dirty and expect your enemy to be fair and square. It's a war after all. All is fair there. So it only makes sense Ukraine started hitting back. Let's talk about it in our next chapter. Fast forward to late September 2024, and Ukrainian missiles hit the Belgorod power plant and the neighboring substations. Started at least. Or continued, better say. Within minutes, Belgorod city plunged into darkness. Stary Oskol went dark, Shebekino went dark, whole communities lost water, heat and light literally in a single day. People were trapped in elevators, hospitals switched to emergency generators. The region, already traumatized by shelling, suddenly found itself in a blackout worthy of a post-apocalyptic movie. 2 days later, Russia responded by striking the Kharkiv plant again, as if repeating the same cycle would somehow produce a different outcome, and you all know the saying about the insanity, right? And so instantly the pro-war community erupted with rage, not at the war itself, but at the Kremlin's decisions, but at the idea that Russia was not retaliating strong enough. They argued over imaginary options, fantasizing about decisive strikes, as if Russia was holding back some kind of a magical superweapon that nobody knows about. Well, but the real question, the only question that actually matters, was drowned beneath all this noise. How do you stop blackouts in Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk and every other your own region now living in fear? As Ukrainian strikes grew more precise and more frequent, Russia is discovering the painful truth. What it normalized in Ukraine is now happening on its own territory. The Kremlin thought the West would never allow Ukraine to respond. They thought Ukraine would sit and endure endless winters without heat. But starting in 2023 and escalating dramatically in 2024-25, Ukraine began hitting back, as expected. And here is where the story becomes even more dangerous for the Kremlin. Some Russian cities were already on the verge of energy collapse before the Ukrainian strikes. Years of neglect had turned regional power grids into rusted skeletons, held together by duct tape and forgotten Soviet engineering. But after hundreds of drone hits on oil depots, power stations and substations, the situation is genuinely critical. This winter, certain Russian regions are facing an energy crisis that has nothing to do with NATO and everything to do with 2 decades of corruption, decay and war. When Belgorod went dark, it was not just because of a missile. It was because the system itself was already failing. It was because regional authorities could not care less about the population that they were entrusted to them. It was because Putin never cared about protecting Russians in the first place. But believe it or not, Russian propaganda still managed to make these attacks look patriotic to endure. Civilians also do their part in fighting the enemy, they said. We struggle together, we win together, so sit tight, don't complain, and wait until your glorious soldiers win this confrontation with the Satan himself. And guess what? Many people believe them. It's just that mostly these were the people who never experienced the blackout, sitting safe in their warm, cozy apartments in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Let's talk about the unbelievable work of propaganda in our next chapter. When Russia launched its infrastructure campaign in 22, the propaganda machine did not even bother pretending anymore. Gone were the stories about liberating Ukrainians, gone was the idea that Russian forces only fought Nazis. Instead, media personalities openly mocked Ukrainian civilians trying to stay warm or recharge their phones. Russia's Today director Margarita Simonyan asked mockingly, "What's up with your power supply, neighbors?" I mean, come on. Okay, I guess. Channel 1's anchors smirked through the scripts about Kyiv preparing for winter without heat. Electricity is not your right, they repeated, it's a privilege. And then there was Yevgenia Petrukhina, who laughed on live television about 18-year-old Ukrainian girl who died from carbon monoxide poisoning while sheltering in the basement with a generator after a Russian strike. She called the tragedy a lesson of common sense, believe it or not. That was the moment Russia dropped any pretense of moral high ground. It was not about defeating the Kyiv regime anymore. It was about inflicting pain on civilians at this point. It was about making life unlivable. It was about breaking people, not armies. Even then, Russia's own generals condemned the strategy. Alexander Rudskoy, the only vice president in Russia's history and a decorated war hero, shredded the tactic as madness and treason. Who's the moron behind this plan, he asked publicly. I mean, you cannot ask this kind of questions in Russia, as you can imagine. Do they think people left without water and heat will fall in love with Russia? Makes sense. But the Kremlin didn't care. They had already entered the phase of the war where they believed brutality was the strength. And today this very logic is blowing up in their own faces. The strikes hitting Belgorod, Kursk, Bryansk, Oryol, and even Moscow suburbs, they all follow the precedent Russia created. When you wage a war that targets substations and heat plants, you eventually find your own substations and heat plants under attack. So then don't complain once again. And when your electrical grid is falling apart, literally and metaphorically, after decades of corruption, you can no longer defend it. Here is the truth nobody on Russian state TV dares to say out loud. There is only one way to stop Belgrade from being bombed. One way to protect Kursk from drones. Only one way to keep Bryansk from going dark. Only one way to guarantee Moscow will not be next. And it's not a buffer zone, not pushing the borders back, not destroying energy infrastructure of Ukraine harder. No, the answer is embarrassingly simple. Just end the war. Simple as that. Since February 24, 2022, Putin has had dozens of peaceful resolutions proposed. He ignored every single one of them. Even in February 2025, when Trump administration offered him the most favorable peace terms imaginable, terms he could have spun a narrative as a victory, he still refused. He preferred war, he preferred the destruction. He preferred saving his own ego instead of saving Russian lives. And the cost of that ego is every targeted power plant in Belgorod, every oil depot hit in Kursk, every substation burning in Bryansk, every family sitting in the dark inside Russia through a winter colder and more dangerous than any of the last 30 years. Those power plants were not built in a day. They're all built by generations of Russian and Soviet engineers, people who have spent their lives constructing a future. And now, Putin is spending that future like loose change. Generations-long projects wiped out in seconds, infrastructure that took decades to build, destroyed for a war that never needed to happen in the first place. Russia is now borrowing from its future to survive the present. And every day this war continues, Russia loses more of what cannot be rebuilt. And here is the truth the Kremlin cannot say out loud. Ukraine will keep striking Russian infrastructure for as long as Russia strikes Ukraine's. Stopping the war is the only way to stop the blackouts. Ever since 2022, Putin has been throwing boomerangs into the sky. Propaganda boomerangs, military boomerangs, moral boomerangs. And they are all coming back now, hard. The first major wave was the mobilization crisis, the second was the drone war, now comes the third, the slow, grinding collapse of Russia's own power grid. And until Putin acknowledges he was wrong, the nights in Russia will only get darker and colder. Well, there you go, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to join our private Telegram group, you can do so by becoming our Patreon member or YouTube channel member. The links are down below. You will receive an invitation link instantly. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for your support. See you tomorrow. We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway.